Bienvenidos a todos. Muchas gracias por asistir a otra conferencia de Ecuador Libre en colaboración con la Universidad de las Américas para discutir temas de filosofía, política y economía sobre cuestiones de actualidad, ¿no? Y especialmente para pensar sobre el futuro de la crisis económica, política y social que se viene luego de la pandemia, con todo lo que está significado. Nuestro invitado hoy día es el profesor Michael Munger, es profesor de Ciencia Política y director del PP Certificate Program en Duke University. Como nuestro invitado hoy día habla inglés, voy a tener que cambiarme a hablar inglés a partir de este momento. Welcome to another conference of Ecuador Libre and Universidad de las Américas to discuss the philosophy, politics, and economics of current issues, and especially to think about the future under the pandemic crisis that changed a lot of things. One of the things that has changed is the way you do conference right now. And here we are conferencing in Zoom. Our guest today is Professor Michael Munger. He's a professor of political science and director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Certificate Program at Duke University. His primary research focuses on the functioning of the markets, regulations, and government institutions. He has taught at Dartmouth College, University of Texas, and University of North Carolina. He's a past president of the Public Choice Society. Professor Munger has written extensively about the interaction between politics and economics, about free trade and interest groups, and recently about what he calls the third economic revolution, the sharing revolution, the big economic change we're experimenting as we speak. He has a book called Tomorrow 3.0, where he develops that idea. On the other hand, he also has a wonderful book, which is titled as a question, Is capitalism sustainable? In that book, he claims without hesitation that, I quote, capitalism is the essential organizing system for large societies. There are no other contenders. We're going to begin with a conversation with Professor Munger. Please write down your question in the chat, whether you're in Facebook or in Twitter or here in Zoom. Please write down your questions, and we're going to make them in the Q&A we have after talk. So, Professor Munger, just one question to begin with. Is capitalism sustainable after the COVID crisis?
It's not clear to me that capitalism is sustainable in the first place. First, let me make an apology. The reason that we have to speak in English here is that my Spanish is so terrible. I learned it in Chile, and Chileans don't speak Spanish, and so I'm going to have to speak to you in English, but I apologize for that. I'll try to speak slowly enough, because sometimes I get carried away. The question is capitalism sustainable after the COVID crisis? Let me break it down into two parts. First, there is a tendency in capitalism that I have noticed that many people on the left have commented on for a long time. And about 5 years ago, I started to realize that I was making a mistake that I accused many of my friends on the left of making. So it goes like this. I have some friends from Venezuela. I have many leftists that are friends in the faculty here at Duke. And I will say, look, clearly socialism does not work. All the examples that we've seen of socialism are failed economic systems. So you look at Cuba, you look at Korea, you look at Venezuela, and they say, oh, well, that's not real socialism. Well, yes, but that's what socialism becomes, because socialism does two things. It concentrates power in one political party, and it eliminates the price mechanism and entrepreneurship from the process of economic production. So if you take away economic production and you take away competition in the political system, you're going to have a failed society. And they will say, no, that's not real socialism, because I can imagine a socialism that's better than that. Well, I always thought, oh, my friends on the left, they're just not very smart. I'm far too smart to make a mistake like that. But sometime around 5 years ago, when I had seen in the United States in the period 2008 and 2009, massive government bailouts of large Wall Street companies that had intentionally taken risks as a way of making sure they would get taxpayer money to make good their losses. Because notice how this works. Suppose you can go to a casino, and if you win, you get to keep the money. And if you lose, somebody else will give you taxpayer money. Well, that's a really good game if you can play it. Now, there's an old saying in the United States that if I owe you $1,000 and I go bankrupt, I'm in trouble. If I owe you $10 million and I go bankrupt, you're in trouble. If I owe you enough, then I have power. Paradoxically, I have power. And so the capitalist system in the United States has shown a tendency towards excessive risk. Now, you can say, but that's really a problem of democracy. It's the government bailouts, the promise of government bailouts that are really the problem. Right. So people say, that's not real capitalism. That's crony capitalism. But wait, if we think that socialism tends towards failed societies, why isn't it true that capitalism in a democracy tends towards cronyism? And if there's no such thing as capitalism, then it's cronyism that we have to deal with. So what worries me is that the United States, and if you look, most other so-called capitalist countries that are in democracies, have very substantial government sectors, much of which is devoted to providing subsidies to politically powerful groups. Sometimes it's capital, sometimes it's labor unions, but the point is that capitalism is not sustainable because there's a tendency for entrepreneurs to recognize that at some point they're better off hiring lobbyists than they are engineers and marketers, workers. So in order for capitalism to be sustainable, the following condition would have to be true. I'm a founder of a new company. This happened to Microsoft. Microsoft, the large software company in the United States, for 15 years after it was founded, they didn't have any lobbyists at all, because as long as they made new products and they could find ways to sell them and they could do better than their competitors in serving customers, they didn't need to enlist the government. But at some point, and this is just a calculus condition in economics, at some point, the last engineer that I hire has to be more productive than the first lobbyist. At some point, the first lobbyist becomes pretty productive because I can get profits from getting subsidies from the state. Well, if that's true, then once I have a lobbyist, then I probably am going to hire more. And so Microsoft now has an entire building in Washington, D.C., an entire block on K Street, which is basically the church of lobbyists in Washington. So the question is, in COVID, is it likely to be worse or better? And so what we've seen during the COVID crisis in the United States is the concentration of decision-making power and the attempt to manage prices and the allocation of scarce resources on a scale that until now has not really happened. So the problem is that the way to make money right now in the capitalist system called the United States is not to make something consumers want to buy. It's something that the government wants you to make. And that is the end of capitalism. So I'm worried that capitalism is not sustainable already, and that the COVID crisis is going to set us back many years. I'm more worried than I've ever been. You're muted.
You talk about thanks. That was a good answer. You said something like it's really important. You talk about crony capitalism, but there's like a huge problem when people identify crony capitalism with capitalism itself. Is that happening in the U.S. in the United States? Because they're blaming the free trade capitalism, the free enterprise capitalism, for the problems that crony capitalism creates.
It is a problem with the United States, and that's why I gave that example. My friends who are socialists will tell me, no, Venezuela, that's not socialism. Well, okay, I think it is socialism. I think that it is inevitably what socialism becomes. Their response is, okay, but cronyism is inevitably what capitalism becomes, because think of the logic of it. If you're trying to maximize profits and you're an entrepreneur. Your stockholders at some point say, we notice that you are passing up lobbying that would get us favorable subsidies and trade protection and patents. And we want you to go out and get those things for us. And you say, no, that's not capitalism. I have scruples. It would be immoral for me because I'm a real entrepreneur. I won't do it. Well, there's a competitive market for managers. If you won't do it, we can hire someone who will. And even if we don't hire a new person, someone is looking at the value of my capital that's represented by my stock price. My stock price would be higher if I would engage in cronyism, if I would approach the government and say, look, we need subsidies. We need trade protection. It is terrible that these products from Ecuador or South America are being imported. We need trade protection to help save American jobs. I can use politics to increase my profits. So you can say, oh no, that's not capitalism, that's cronyism. In a democracy, that's what capitalism always becomes, and it is the logic of profits that drive us there because of the competitive market for managers and for the market for mergers and acquisitions. Both of those drive managers to seek higher accounting profits. And at some point, the system breaks and it becomes cronyist. So the question is, within the logic of a capitalist system, how can we prevent that tendency? And interestingly, I think the answer is character. But remember, one of the things that public choice teaches us is that we cannot rely on the good moral character of actors. We want rules and systems that control greed. And the great thing about markets is that me acting in my self-interest provide benefits for you. But that's not true if the system is open to rent seeking. The question is, how would we keep the system from being open to rent seeking? That's the problem.
You mentioned something really interesting. You mentioned something related to intellectual property. You mentioned patents. Actually, people usually they relate with patents with the good, like as a good institution of market institution. How can you say that they are bad for capitalism? Could you explain us that like in detail?
The problem is telling whether an idea is sufficiently original and whether we should credit to one person. So software in particular, one of the great things that has universalized access to capitalism is the fact that almost anyone can write software. Somebody in Guayaquil could write an app and put it up on the App Store, and if people want to buy it, it's okay. Now, that's a trademark. That's not a patent. Suppose I'm Uber, and I want to patent the idea of using cell phone apps to call a taxi. Well, Uber as the app makes money because it's providing a service. But if we give Uber a patent and say, yes, you are the only company that can use cell phones to call taxis, that's creating an artificial barrier to entry into competition. So the question is, how much is the scope of the protection? So a trademark or a copyright means that I can write software and you cannot use my software. A patent says you can't write your own software that does the same thing in a different way. So the problem that we have is the line around patents. And so if you look at drug companies in the United States, they'll patent a drug, and then they'll put a plastic cover on it and say that that's new, and they'll patent it again, and they get another 20 years protection. So I think patents should be more specific and shorter. 5 years in a technological economy, 5 years is plenty of time. 20 years is too long. So we have patent trolls in the United States. People will buy up patents, and then if you try to use even one small part of this software, they will sue you. And it's as if all the castles along the Rhine River in Germany. So the castles along the Rhine River were all designed as toll booths. They would put a chain across the river and your barge could not go down the Rhine until you paid the toll. But there were so many castles that barge traffic along the Rhine stopped. The only way that they could get rid of it was to force all of these castles to give up their implicit right to charge a toll. So the patent system I have argued sometimes with my friend Richard Epstein, the law professor at the University of Chicago. He's a defender of the current patent system. I think patents were an important part of development, but I think trademark protections for software are sufficient now. You cannot use my software. You can't just copy my software. But if you want to do the same thing in a different way, you're welcome to do that.
There's people who say, I have had this conversation with people who say in this crisis, and they tell me, how the hell is the drug companies are going to invest money in the COVID vaccine if they don't know they're going to make a lot of money because of the patent system? They said that there's no incentive for that. What do you think of that?
That's absolutely right. And that's the flip side to my argument, is that in order for you to make a large risky investment, the expected value of the return has to be large enough for that to make sense. Now, if I could invest $500 million and be sure that I would get a virus as a result, the government could just pay it. But what we're doing is saying, all right, you 10 companies, all of you go and invest $500 million. And whoever gets there first will get $2 billion. Well, in expected value, that doesn't make sense. So the companies are saying, this is not a bet, that it's irresponsible. If I have a 1 in 10 chance of 2 billion, I'm not going to spend 500 million. That's a waste of taxpayer money. And so the question is how to solve that problem. And it looks like what the United States is going to do is try to use government subsidies, which have a history of failure. So there's a lot of companies that are working on this. On the other hand, the polio vaccine was developed under the government system. The difficulty that we have is it took 5 years for the polio vaccine to be developed from the time it was discovered. We need something in a year. That's not going to happen unless we enlist market forces. And so we have to find a way to thread that needle. It's a very good question. The big difference between the United States and South Korea, I don't know if you know this, but South Korea and the United States both had their first COVID-19 case on January 20th, 2020. South Korea immediately licensed private laboratories to start giving tests. The United States, the capitalist country, centralized our testing in the CDC, which is a corrupt, incompetent government agency. They actually botched the test. They got it wrong. So Korea, using the private sector, had private testing by middle of February. Whoa. The United States didn't have government testing until the middle of March. And so a big part of the reason why the United States is having such a crisis now is the refusal to enlist the creative power of the market and the ability of the market to move things very quickly. So that the ability to mobilize supply chains is the argument for the market. And I frankly don't understand why people in the United States don't recognize that. The government doesn't provide us with food. We have private grocery stores. It's really hard to do that. And for a little while, we were short on meat. We were short on toilet paper. We have all those things now. We still don't have testing because the government is in charge of it.
But so do you think the regulation in the U.S. is, in the present like sanitary or health crisis, is more a problem than a solution? It has made things worse?
Well, I should be careful. We have an astonishing capacity to deliver healthcare. And so even small cities in the United States have a pretty decent sized hospital with highly trained doctors and nurses and a lot of ventilators. So we were talking a bit before we started this conference. Right now in North Carolina, which is a state of 12 million people, it's quite a populous state, the state that I live in, we have less than 10 deaths per day from COVID-19. We have 2,000 or 3,000 new cases every day, but we only have 5 or 10 deaths because our ability to deliver healthcare is very good. We do not have an ability to respond quickly. The thing that markets can do is to respond quickly, and that we have not managed. But we do have a lot of infrastructure, and so I think we can kid ourselves that we're doing okay, but we could do better. We haven't done that badly, given our population and the number of cases, but we could do better.
One thing that happened to us, I was part of a trust called Salvar Vidas, which pretty much was gathering money donations to buy respirators. And one big problem we had was the restriction on export from the US. What do you think of that? Should a government be able to restrict a person who wants to sell a ventilator to another country on grounds that it is on this crisis? Or do you think that's legitimate for a government to do?
You can see a static and a dynamic argument for that. If you think that the total amount of stuff is fixed and we don't have enough, then you can see an argument for no, we need to keep this in the United States. But if you recognize that the genius of the capitalist system dynamically is to create a lot more of the stuff, then you would say we should use the price system to signal the fact that more competent, energetic people should turn their energies towards this. So in the United States, we have something called price gouging laws. We have laws against prices that go up after an emergency. The problem is that price is a response to scarcity. And so your question is a good one. Scarcity is a result of the virus. What they're saying is you cannot use the price mechanism, but not using the price mechanism makes the problem of scarcity worse, not better. If the price goes up, three things happen. First, consumers use less. Second, producers make more. And third, entrepreneurs find ways to make substitutes. So suppose that we really wanted to increase the number of ventilators in the United States. What we should do is open our market so that we can sell ventilators to South America, because that means the price of ventilators will go up in the United States, and Ford Motor Company, General Motors, air conditioning companies, everybody will switch. They'll say, look, this high price is signaling that this is an important activity. So we probably would have more ventilators now in the United States. I'm not saying in the world, but just in the United States, if the United States had allowed export of ventilators. And that seems paradoxical. I think many people on the left don't understand that because they see the world as a fixed pie. Wealth is a fixed pie. We will divide it among ourselves. And if you get something, it means I lose it. But in a capitalist system, the pie gets bigger. And using the price mechanism as a signal to say, all right, everyone focus their efforts on making more ventilators, we would have helped the rest of the world, and the United States would be better off, even though at first it's true there would have been a shortage of ventilators. That's the point. That's why the price would have gone up.
That's so true, and that mentality caused a lot of problems here, because in the middle of the crisis, we got politicians all over the world saying, no, we cannot sell you these respirators. And that was a fixed
pie. They all think for you to get something has to make me worse off, because they never studied economics.
Yeah, that's the reason they should do the program on philosophy, politics, and economics you direct. Changing a little bit the subject, we're going to something you have written about, and you said in an article that this kind of crisis, I mean, it's destruction of wealth. Normally, you cannot say that this is a good thing in itself, but normally this kind of crisis, as you say in the article, brings the opportunity of like a new birth. What do you think this is going to be that kind of opportunity to rebuild the institution in the U.S. and around the world?
It may very well be an opportunity. I'm not sure we'll take advantage of the opportunity. It might get worse, but Mansur Olson famously in his 1982 book, The Rise and Decline of Nations, said he was trying to work on a puzzle. Why was it that after World War II, there were two great growth stories in the world, Japan and Germany? If you look, the three powers, the three Axis powers were Germany, Japan, and Italy. But Italy gave up in late 1943, and so they were not really taken over. Their government was not completely taken over by the Allies. Whereas Germany and Japan, all of their interest groups were wiped out. All of their labor unions, all of the people who were clustered like leeches, like parasites that were using up the tax money by having rents and entitlements. Those were all wiped out. That meant that Japan and Germany could choose capitalist systems without having all of these sort of Peronist, like in Argentina, obligations to, well, we have to pay this group, we have to pay this group, we have to pay this group. And so as a result, if you get growth, you can actually accomplish things with it. Whereas in the Peronistas, they have to pay and they have to pay. So any increase that you get, an awful lot of the proceeds get paid to interest groups. Now, the question is, so Olson's theory was, war is terrible. You would never want it to happen. But the advantage of losing a war badly is that interest groups and all of these structures of domination and parasitism are destroyed. Well, it struck me that this crisis, a lot of large, lazy companies in the United States are going to go out of business. And the ones that survive will have passed through a kind of refining fire. So the airlines that survive are going to be very efficient. The hotels that survive, they're going to be very efficient because they will have gotten rid of all their inefficient processes. The result will be that the economy will perform a lot better if it's allowed to. So I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but it's a consequence, and I think it's a reason to be optimistic. So there's a possibility that the sort of Washington consensus will emerge on the other side of this with a sense of hope for development, that developing nations should recognize that they cannot depend on these failed mechanisms of government control and price management, that they need to use the capitalist system that will allow a more dynamic and creative response. Because a lot of people in the United States are furious at how inefficient our government has been in responding to the crisis. So the New York Times today, basically Pravda, the Soviet equivalent of the New York Times, they published today an article saying that their government was failing to provide public schools and they should investigate private schools. For the New York Times to publish something like that means that the sense of distrust and betrayal by citizens is reaching a level that I haven't seen.
Yeah, Sophie, you mentioned the New York Times right now. As you say, it has become like a symbol of the new ideological atmosphere you're living in the US. And we see from here, we see the news and something is happening in the US. We see the social justice movements that seeing signs of oppression in pretty much everything, like from Paw Patrol, which my daughter loves, to saying that only women menstruate or things like that. So yeah. What about? Could you make us clear the reasons that is happening? Is that really a risk for democracy in the U.S.?
Well, it's certainly a risk for democracy because democracy is always at risk. I think both of our parties. Now, I would say this because I'm a member of a third party. I'm a libertarian. I'm actually running for office right now. I'm running for the North Carolina legislature right now. So you have to realize that, of course, I'm going to say this, but both of the state-sponsored parties in the United States have become so close to government that they're no longer reliable as representing the people. And so Hillary Clinton in 2016 managed to lose an election to a not very good candidate, Donald Trump, because she had completely abandoned her husband's program. Remember, her husband's program is, it's the economy, stupid, let's grow the economy and let's appeal to the working class. The Democrats for a long time were the working class party in the United States. They have abandoned the working class. The working class party is now the Republicans. So if you look at the list of things, the sort of populist, and I worry Peronist policies of the Republicans are just populism of the worst sort, and the Democrats are social justice of the worst sort. There's no one who's saying we actually should care about running the government well and improving the economy, but that's what most voters want. So I actually think that there's a chance that this crisis will lead towards a realignment of the parties because neither of the two state-sponsored parties is doing a very good job on this. They're being dominated by the extremists that vote in primaries, because the US has a primary system. We choose candidates based just on the few party members who are extremists. And then when we run in the general election, people say, where do these people come from? They're crazy. But you have to choose one of them. So again, in 2020, we're going to get a choice between an old crazy guy and an even older crazy guy.
Yeah, that's a weird situation you're getting there. From a classic liberal perspective, what about the current U.S. government? I mean, for some libertarians, as you, and from some other, it's like Trump is a good president. From other libertarians, he's the worst president in history. What do you think about in terms of ideological coherence?
One of the problems libertarians have is that we're actually, as far as I can tell, the only ones who are ideologically coherent, because we have a set of principles. And so I'll be talking to a Democrat or a Republican, and they say, well, you know, some things you say seem right, but I disagree with the others. Yes, because you have principles on some things and you abandon them on the others. So Donald Trump, in many ways, has deregulated parts of the economy. He has called back some of the great excesses of the Obama administration in environmental regulation, in safety regulation that didn't really serve much of a purpose, in some kinds of workplace regulation. So if you just look at those things, I can see you might say, all right, Donald Trump is doing a good job. But on an international trade and on management of prices, he's constantly creating uncertainty about investment opportunities because he just makes stuff up. And on his international trade policy. So a lot of companies would make investments, and then the United States would just announce our trade policy is going to be different. And investments that I have, supply chain that I have, is wiped out. So I don't think that Donald Trump is a very good president in terms of libertarian principle. But he does appeal to many people who want someone to say, I dislike the left, because Donald Trump is scornful of the left. I don't think he offers a very good program instead. It's not capitalism. It's just, I'm not a leftist. Let's all make fun of the left. And that appeals to many people. So I'm frustrated that the people that I know that like Donald Trump, and I do know many people who like Donald Trump, if you ask, what do you like about him? They'll say, well, he tells the truth. Not, he has policies that are going to help the American economy.
Yeah, so thanks for your answer. Coming back to another question, another topic, which is, I mean, social justice warriors, George Floyd. You have an interesting article that pretty much says that the state abusing power is the state being itself. I mean, there's like ingenuity in trying to conceive the state as some institution that won't abuse power, because that is what it does. I mean, it has a monopoly of violence, and if you have the monopoly of violence, you tend to be violent. So, what is your take on that regarding George Floyd events and everything that happened in the last weeks?
Well, I actually got that argument from Ludwig von Mises in his book Socialism. And but Mises says a very interesting thing. He says many people want to make the government more like a business. You can't do that because businesses rely on voluntary transactions. The only way you'll buy my product is if you think it will make you better off and that you're willing to pay the price that I'm offering. Government is not based on voluntary transactions. So Max Weber, the German sociologist, actually defined the state as the organization with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So what the state can do is say, we're going to decide something, and then we can use tanks and guns and attack helicopters to force everyone to go along. And actually, in some circumstances, you can think that might work. Suppose that I consent. One of my heroes, James Buchanan, one of the founders of the Public Choice Society, said that as long as it's voluntary, coercion can actually be justified. If you and I enter into a contract, I want you to put a new roof on my house, and I tell you that I'll pay you to do it. After you put the roof on my house and I say, no, I won't do it, it makes sense to have coercion to enforce the contract. Well, what if the contract is not a bilateral one between you and me, but it's between 1 million of us because we want to build a road system? Then I get the road system even if I don't pay the amount that I promised to pay. Now, that's not a tax. That's an agreement when I signed the contract. The problem is that that's not the way the government works. We don't all agree to something and then the government enforces, okay, you said you volunteered to pay, you have to pay. What happens instead is that elected representatives say, how can we spend this money? All right, we'll spend it this way. And we'll send people with guns to your house to take it and kill you if you don't pay those taxes. So it's a little bit different. It's not voluntary. The state is of its essence the use of violence. Now, what we see is that police in the United States, because they have power, often misuse it in a way that represents prejudice, bigotry. They help their friends, they harm their enemies. The only way to solve that problem, according to Ludwig von Mises, is to have at most a minimal state, because the state operates based on discretionary violence. It's very difficult to control the discretion of the state. The only way to solve it, von Mises says, is to reduce the extent of the state. You can't say, let's make it more like a business. So if you have police that are in charge of everything, if the United States has so many laws, we have laws against drugs, we have laws against jaywalking. It's been estimated that many people commit 3 felonies or more every week. It's just up to the police whether they enforce it or not. The result is that we're going to use power. There's the discretion of the police about who to use power against. Unsurprisingly, it's against poor people, Black people, disenfranchised people, immigrants, the weak. Why would a system based on power protect the weak?
So do you think there's a systemic problem? There's a problem of systemic racism in the police in the US?
Yes. Yes, I do. The problem is not that the police are racists. I believe in systemic racism, but the system I believe in is that our state is too large. We have too many laws. The way to solve the problem of systemic racism is to get rid of victimless crimes, because so many of the crimes that are the drugs, for example, we break into people's houses and we have a system where if you find money in that house, you get to keep it. This would be piracy. It's called civil forfeiture. So this would be piracy. It's for-profit policing. Police focus their resources on drug busts. They don't, in Detroit, they don't investigate murders. They go after drugs, which is a victimless crime. But the reason is they can make money from doing it. So the system that we have that's based on power and too many laws and for-profit policing has created systemic racism. I don't think that it's the police's fault. The police are in a position that's impossible. We need fewer laws and less use of power is the only way to solve it.
How your proposal differs from people who says defund the police? Because many people I have heard, okay, that is coherent with the minimum government argument that, okay, defund it, make it shorter. What do you think of that? No, we should not defund the police. We should have fewer laws. We should have laws against murder, theft of property, and assault. That's pretty much it. And if the police are just enforcing those laws, racism would be far less of a problem. But instead, we have police that are supposed to be intrusive in all sorts of neighborhoods that are dangerous. And a big part of the reason why they're dangerous is that drugs that are illegal are expensive. The only way that I can get enough drugs to feed my habit is to steal. And so we all steal from each other because we live in the same neighborhood. Legalization of marijuana, for example, a lot of police have actually come to this position. So police are advocating for the legalization of marijuana, because then people would be able to obtain that without stealing. Crime would actually go down for 2 reasons. First, we would legalize marijuana, but second, the price of it would fall by so much that I wouldn't have to steal in order to be able to buy it. And as a result, a lot of poor neighborhoods would be much less poor.
So poverty is a big cause of crime. But our system keeps people in poverty because we have laws against voluntary exchanges like the sale of marijuana.
What do you say about the hardcore drugs? Do you favor the legalization of every drugs whatsoever? Because for Latin America, that's a big problem, huge problem. I mean, we are fighting a war. We are fighting a war imposed by the U.S. foreign policy, pretty much. So that's a big question for us. And the only solution we see is like the complete legalization of drugs in the US. Because the only reason they have like money to buy arms, to buy guns, is like, as you mentioned, drugs are really, really expensive due to the illegalizations.
Yep.
What do you think of that?
I think that's a terrible problem, and the United States should be ashamed for having exported its problems like that. But the United States has always treated Latin America as a colony. So that isn't new. I don't think we can do legalization because it's politically impossible. So legalization of heroin, legalization of opium, of poppies, I think that's not possible. But we could decriminalize possession and treat it as a medical problem. So I've always found it strange that we have this system where we say we care so much about you, the heroin addict, that we're going to put you in jail. Well, apparently you don't care that much about me. What you're going to do is take me away from my family and put me in a situation where I learn how to use drugs, how to sell drugs. I make contacts with criminals, and then I have a felony record that prevents me from ever getting a job again. So we have this system that creates a permanent criminal underclass in the United States, and it creates very powerful drug cartels in Latin America, particularly Mexico, but certainly not only in Mexico. So we need to decriminalize possession, and we need to work with Latin American countries to make it possible for other alternative activities to be a substitute, because as it stands, it's very profitable. And the drug cartels, they have better weapons than the rather underarmed militaries and police, certainly, of many Latin American countries. So that's a problem that United States drug laws have created. I would decriminalize, treat it as a medical problem, and then try to help countries find alternative ways of getting peasants to be able to produce enough to live on. I don't know if you can hear me, but you are frozen up.
Sorry, something happened.
Yeah,
I think I froze.
Well,
I was saying that we have a huge problem with that because Ecuador is a transit country. So the cocaine is going out of our coasts, and the policemen, they're underarmed, as you said, and they earn like $800 per month. So there comes the drug trafficker and says, "Well, here you got $5,000 per month, and if you do something, I kill you." So I mean, the incentives are quite clear. Yeah. So we have one final question for you from our spectators. You said you have been in Chile. Chile is a paradox for those of us who defend the liberty and capitalism in Latin America, because it has been really successful. Because it has been really successful. However, politically, it seems like everybody in Chile, or not everybody, but a big majority, is against the system. It's against the same system that gave them the opportunity to have a better lives, to have better consumption habits, to have education. What is the problem with that? And we see kind of the same things in the US with the social justice warriors, with Antifa, which are pretty much on the leftist side against capitalism. We see that with Ocasio-Cortez, which is really famous among the young people. Why is that happening? Why people is against the same system that brings them so many wealth?
I'm actually working on a book on that subject, with Chile as being one of the most important cases. And the title of the book is Prosperous but Angry. And I'm working with Mario Villarreal Diaz, who is at University of Texas.
He has been here in this space.
Well, he and I are working on a book, and the question is, why is it that the most prosperous countries are the ones who are most angry about capitalism? And Chile is in some ways leading the way, but you're also seeing it in the United States. It's going to happen in Europe. I think it's going to happen in China. And China and Chile are a way, I think, of understanding that. What happened was that for a few generations, there was very rapid progress. And workers got pretty significant increases in wages, and their children went to college and to university for the first time. And then we have the problem that their children no longer see the same growth rate, and they look and they see these people that in Shanghai have these beautiful apartments in the penthouse, or in Santiago there are some neighborhoods that are really, really wealthy, and people are driving beautiful cars, and I don't have that. Well, that must be unfair. So I'm not comparing myself to my grandparents who were pobrecitos. I'm comparing myself to these rich bastards, and I don't have as much as they have. And so I think it's very difficult not to let envy seem like injustice. Envy means that I wish I had more than I had, even though no other system. If you look at Chile, Chile has delivered a bigger escape from poverty for more people than any other Latin American system. So if you're in Santiago, there's a bunch of Peruanos who come there, and there's not that many poor Chileans who go to Peru.
The same thing happened with the Ecuadorians.
So Chile, it's better to be poor in Chile than middle class in Peru. But the middle class in Chile feel like they're being ripped off. And I think that's going to happen all over the world. That the sense that we have of, I look at the wealthy people and I think they don't deserve it. In a sense, they don't. Some of them just got lucky. But that luck is what creates the benefits we all depend on. Maybe Steve Jobs just got lucky when he created the iPhone. Many people were working on smartphones, and Steve Jobs came up with the design of the iPhone that everybody wanted. But think of the benefits that everyone has gotten from the creation of smartphones. Think of all the things that replaced. So yes, maybe it is a lottery, but that still means that we need to protect property rights and protect the incentives to create things that other people want to buy. After the fact, you can say, well, I could have done that. You didn't. He did. And that's why our system creates those benefits. So we need, and the work that you're doing here, one of the reasons I like giving talks in situations like this is the work that you're doing here is really important. Because we need to recognize there is no alternative system that is capable of delivering people from poverty at the same scale as capitalism. It's not like there's a competition. Only capitalism can do it. We have to preserve the ability of capitalism to continue to solve the problem of poverty. China and India have had more people come out of poverty in the last 20 years than came out in the previous history of the world combined. So well, partly because they're such big countries, but usually it's sort of slow and you make progress. The poverty rate in China was over 70%, and now it's less than 10%. 1 billion people. Deirdre McCluskey always talks about this, the Great Enrichment. 1 billion people came out of poverty because of capitalism. China was not progressing until they turned in 1973 towards the use of markets. But now, in the third generation after capitalism, they're going to start to face political unrest because people are going to be envious. So our theory, and it's simplistic, is the third generation after capitalism becomes envious and you start to get political problems. And it happens in different countries at different times.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing you are doing that book with Mario, which is a good friend. I bet it's going to be a great book. there's a lot of answers to this question. I has to do with our tribal psychology. You know, like we are not psychological ready, or human nature is not ready for this world of abundance, and just like we are still psychologically in the tribal era. So sure. That's a huge problem.
Yes.
There's one more question here for Fabian Pozo. How to avoid consumption decriminalization to become a loophole for microdealing?
It will be. It's just that that's still better than the current system. The problem with the current system is the corruption of the police force and the destruction of institutions. So it's true that drug use would go up. But if you look at Portugal, for example, had decriminalization of most drugs, including heroin. And actually, the use of many drugs went down, not up. Now, it was expensive, but the United States right now incarcerates a higher proportion of its population than the Soviet Union ever did. Then there's no totalitarian regime that has as many people in jail as the United States does. That's really expensive too. So we don't have to do much better because the current system sucks so bad. All we have to do is not have so many people in jail, and that will free up a lot of funds for paying for neighborhood programs about microdealing. Even the continued drug use is not as big a problem as the destruction of the rule of law, not just in the United States, but in Central America.
Thanks for your answer. That's a really important thing. Going back to the same argument, in Ecuador, we have the problem, and many Latin American countries, that as long as the US doesn't legalize, it won't matter what we do, even if we legalize or not. So we're in a paradoxical situation where we cannot do nothing about it, even though people here are starting to talk about legalization of drugs in general. Well, thanks, Professor. It has been a great talk. Thanks for your time. If you want to say a few words, we hope we will be able to invite you when time comes to come to Ecuador. We will be delighted to have you here. As you know, we're starting with the University de las Americas, a program on philosophy, politics, and economics. I know you know more than anyone how that works. How important is that? If you have some final words for us, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you're doing this, and PPE is growing all over the world. It's growing very rapidly in the United States, and I think the reason is that it accomplishes two things. One, PPE is a leadership program. So it creates people that are capable of occupying leadership positions because they understand the balance between economics, ethical problems, and the application of law. The second thing is that it provides an excuse for reading the great classic works in context. So instead of we'll read this and we'll read this, you're actually interrogating the great thinkers of the past about policy questions. So one of the people get frustrated about history of economic thought because we read this guy, we read this person, we read this woman, you're supposed to memorize what they said. I don't really care. But should we allow the price system to work? What's an equitable distribution of income? How should we think about the law? PPE we get a chance to interrogate the great thinkers of the past by reading their works and asking them modern questions. So that's why PPE, I think, is the most important undergraduate major, and I'm very excited that you're doing it.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. We hope to keep reading you and keep watching your videos. Thanks for this time, all the time you have shared with us. And hopefully we will have you here someday when this when the new normality becomes normal again.
All right, sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.